Many refers to Dr. Essop Pahad as a leader on the inside, politically speaking. Is that true?
Well, what is true is that I held leadership positions, both in the South African Communist Party, because I was on the Central Committee and Politburo of the party, as well as the National Executive Committee of the ANC, and was a parliamentary counsellor to Deputy President Mbeki, then Deputy Minister in Mbeki's office, and then Mbeki appointed me Minister in the Presidency. So that, from that point of view, yes, I've had the honor and the privilege and the great pleasure of holding these positions of leadership. But whether or not somebody is a good or bad leader is for others to decide.
Right. But if you take the leadership positions that you and others occupied in when you were in exile and when you came back into the country, you again occupied as an unbanned people and organization as the ANC and the Communist Party, leadership positions. What was the difference in that transition of leadership from being in exile to being now considered a legal person in political speaking terms of the apartheid system?
It is an immense difference, because when you are in exile, there are times when the light at the end of the tunnel is very, very dim. And there have been many periods in our history in which the movement suffered a great number of setbacks. But you were always optimistic that change will come, that in the end the movement will succeed in overthrowing the system of apartheid and racism. But you always felt that you were very far away from home. And so one of the things that I think the most important thing you missed in exile was this daily contact with the masses of the people. This being in a position in which, as events unfolded, you were there and perhaps could have a more deeper understanding of the processes that were also taking place. The advantage, and it was a very great advantage for those who were in exile and who utilized the opportunity, was that you had a great amount of time to read, to study, to discuss, to debate, to get involved in all of these discussions, not only with your own comrades, but also with many other people, so that whilst we were in exile in England, we were able to engage in very serious political discussions with people in the British Communist Party, in the Labour Party, others on the left of these organizations. When I was in Prague as a representative of the South African Communist Party on the World Marxist Review, it was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to be able to meet representatives of communist parties from all over the world. And that gave one an opportunity to learn about their countries, for example, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, the Philippines. And then my closest friend was Ahmad Dansoko, who was from Senegal. He was the General Secretary of the African Party of Independence and Labour. And I guess in my life, Ahmad taught me more about the continent than any other individual I can think of except for Mbeki. Because Ahmad was a veritable source of information about the African continent. And he understood a lot of the political dynamics that were taking place. And so exile gave you this opportunity, if you used it properly, to broaden the scope and the extent of your knowledge, not only about your own country, not only about your own movement, but about the revolutionary movements in the world, about how other people struggle. So in the course of that, for example, I had some very close friends from the Communist Party of Iraq, one or two of whom were killed when they went back into the underground in Iraq by Saddam Hussein. I remember a Brazilian comrade, was a member of the Communist Party of Brazil Central Committee. I met him at the party school in Moscow. He left, went back into the underground in Brazil, was arrested and killed. And so the question of the readiness to make the supreme sacrifice for a revolutionary cause wasn't restricted to South Africans. So you learned very quickly that there were very many other parties and movements that were facing similar and sometimes even more dangerous conditions of struggle. And that enabled us to then have that deeper understanding of international developments, of the world. For us, the question of our relationship with the Soviet Union and the socialist countries, the tremendous amount of assistance that we received from the Soviet Union and other socialist countries was an eye-opener about how you must be ready sometimes to sacrifice your own national interest for the broader international good. So those who stayed in South Africa then unfortunately were deprived of this opportunity to really benefit from this interaction that we were able to have with the rest of the world. And so in that sense, exile was a very difficult period in one's life, very complex sometimes, very debilitating sometimes because you didn't know whether you were going back home, but at the same time, very, very, very enriching in political terms, and nothing, but nothing can replace that period in our lives for those of us who were in exile and who chose to benefit from the opportunity that it offered us. Lastly, we participated in many demonstrations. We went to all of the campaign for nuclear disarmament Easter marches that took place every year that I was in England. With Mbeki, we started the International Students Organization, which brought together student organizations from different parts of the world. When the Greek colonels took over Greece, we went and participated in organizing demonstrations against the Greek colonels. We were very, very active in the international solidarity movement with what I consider to be the greatest guerrilla fighters the history has ever seen, the Vietnamese revolutionary movement, the same when the Pinochet took over Chile. So we were able then to not only interact with people from these countries, but also to be able to participate in international solidarity actions with people who were struggling against oppression, against exploitation, against dictatorship. And that was, as I say, an exceptionally enriching experience for all of us. And I think for many of us, it has lived with us. And so for us always, internationalism, international solidarity is a cornerstone of our political beliefs and understanding.
How did that influence those lessons and experiences through international interaction on areas of oppression, but also international solidarity, influence your involvement in the negotiations for the new constitutional sector?
Well, I guess some of it is subconscious in the sense that you learn from other people's experience. I mean, I remember the representative of the Communist Party of the Philippines, Philip Malaya, very sophisticated mind, very calm person. And in the course of all our discussions, you understood how, even under the most extreme circumstances, you should be patient. You should understand the other people's point of view, how you needed to work and function in a way with a broader set of political forces outside your own movement. And so this idea that at some point have a negotiated resolution of the conflict in South Africa, those lessons you learn partly from interacting with others and seeing how their own struggles developed. You will then recall that, for example, when Salazar, the emperor of Portuguese fascism and colonialism in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Sao Tome, Principe and Sao Tome, that how the struggle itself in the colonial territories can have such a big impact on the colonial mother country, and that when it seemed as if nothing was going to happen, that, for example, an understanding of the African continent, we're deprived of the African continent, just interacting with them. But for me, it was an artificial division, because those of our comrades who were operating inside the country, whether in the underground of the ANC, the underground of the SACP, or when the UDF was formed in the UDF itself, was an integral part of the revolutionary movement. So to try to cause a division between the two, I think was, as I say, a contrived division. But you did come with different kind of experiences. So those who were in prison for many years then would come out of prison with a very different kind of an experience. The question was whether the movement had the capacity, the movement in general, had the capacity to try to utilize these diverse experiences, not as a form of differences, but as a form of strength for the movement. And I think in many ways we did succeed in bringing together these diverse experiences, which then helped to make the movement a much better organization. Because you will then recall that after we came back from exile in 1990, we had to build the ANC into a mass movement. We had to build the South African Communist Party into a powerful legal party. You had to help COSATU to become the formidable force that it had become. And there were people who came from exile who went to work in COSATU. There were people who came from prison who went and worked in COSATU. So for me, these different experiences were not a basis for unnecessary divisions. But we just had to understand that we came from these, we acquired these different experiences. And if we manage to bring them together, then the movement would be the beneficiary. And the greatest beneficiaries of that would obviously be the people of South Africa.
Let's deconstruct the we. Who are you referring to when you say we?
Oh, we.
Yes.
Yeah, you know.
Who's this we that you're referring to?
When I say we, I mean all of us in the movement. Both those who had the privilege and the honor to occupy positions of leadership, and those who, if you like, the cadres of the movement, those who keep the movement going, because there's no movement can survive on the basis of only its leadership. has to have its membership, it has to have its cadres. So by we, I mean all of us together. Never mind where we came from originally. And when I talk about the leadership, I obviously talk about those who are in the National Executive Committee, in the Central Committee in the Politburo of the party, in the Central Committee of COSATU, in the provincial structures, regional structures, the branch levels. So because you have leadership at all of these different levels, and they all constitute, in my view, if we work properly, part of a whole, so that you can't really separate the one from the other. Obviously, the National Executive Committee is the highest policy-making body of the organization in between national conferences. The Central Committee and the Politburo, the same in the SACP. But without your branches, you can have your leadership, but I don't know what they will be doing or who they will be leading.
Right. Give us insight into an Essop Pahad view, insight into the complexities in CODESA 1, 2, in particular the one that where there were lots of difficulties to get off the ground, the second one. Give us your own insight into as a way to give expression to an unfettered, unedited way of looking at it.
Well, one, we obviously had very little experience of that kind of negotiations. We had accumulated different kinds of experiences, both inside and outside the country. The second one was, fortunately for us, I think, the National Party underestimated our capacity when they thought they knew everything. And the third one was that led by the ANC, because in CODESA I was part of the SACP delegation. The two main ones were Joe Slovo, who led the party delegation, and then myself, and then from time to time others would join us like Tenjiwe Ntinso, Jeremy Cronin, and at the big meetings, of course, Chris Hani would lead the SACP delegation. But what you had to, first of all, at least speaking for myself, is overcome that prejudice of sitting opposite your oppressors. Now, in the same commission that I was involved in, we had Chris Yenes and Kobi Kutsia,
Minister of Justice.
who was then the so-called justice.
In the apartheid government.
Yeah, in the apartheid government. Now you had to deal with, they had to deal with us, but we had to deal with them in a way in which you had to forget, in a serious way, that, if you like, this was an enemy.
Right.
So you had to begin to internalize that you were talking to a political opponent. And that in the course of the discussions, you, not only me, but our whole team in the ANC team, had to demonstrate a far greater depth of political understanding and thought, which actually, by the way, wasn't all that difficult for me, I think, given where we came from and given where the National Party comes from, because they were too narrow-minded. They had very little understanding of the world. They had actually very little understanding about South Africa itself. The other advantage that the ANC had were two mainly for me. One was that the ANC had set up a much broader team which used to meet on a very regular basis. There were those who were involved in the actual negotiations, and so we would debate the kind of positions that we needed to take on critical issues that were confronting us in the negotiations. And so the ANC was able, through this mechanism, to create the conditions for us to arrive at a better and a common understanding of what positions we should take. So it wasn't you just sitting there as an individual and thinking on the top of your head. At least you were guided by this. In the SACP, with Joe Slovo and some of the others, like Edward Daniels, who is now our state law advisor, who's also part of the team. We used to meet, or try to meet at least even once a week, where we would discuss the issues that were coming up in the negotiations, and Slovo was, of course, sitting at the very highest levels with Cyril and them, to try to understand what was happening, what are the positions the ANC taking, what are the kind of positions that the party needed to take. Of course, essentially it was in support of the positions that we had arrived at in terms of our own involvement in the ANC commitments. But that helped us to refine our own thinking. The third important element was that the ANC always tried very much to keep its own leadership. Not always with great success, but it tried. And its members at least critically informed about what's happening in the negotiating process. The National Party were unable to do this. The consequence was they were unable to take a great number of their people with them on this issue, whereas we were. And
why were you able to do that?
Well, because we always tried to go back to our people. I mean, with JS and that, every time there was a central committee meeting, the issue of negotiations was an item on the agenda. Every time there was a Politburo meeting, the item of negotiations on the agenda. So you always interacted with the other members of the collective. And there were obviously differences, because sometimes people who are not actually involved in the direct negotiations have a view from the outside. And that view from the outside sometimes is very important, because they were able to see things that perhaps you who's so embroiled in the actual negotiations, because sometimes you're negotiating over words, about concepts and so on and so forth. So from the outside, people could see things that you couldn't see from the inside. From the outside, some of them tended to be more critical about the kind of positions they thought we were taking, because a lot of it came as a consequence of how the negotiations were reported in the media. So on the basis of what was said in the media, they were reacting to it. But in my view, that helped us to improve our own positions, but in a sense helped us to take the movement with us, because it wasn't easy, because you were taking positions sometimes in which you had to compromise on a number of areas, and that wasn't always understood by our own members, by our own people. So you really had to go back and try to explain why you were agreeing to certain compromises, but what was the bottom line for the ANC, and that how we were from that bottom line. And obviously that bottom line was that the negotiations had to lead to a fundamental change which had to be based on a democratic, non-racial elections. And of course we were always confident that in such an election the ANC would win the elections. So secondly, you saw how other political parties were negotiating, and you understood that, don't want to praise ourselves, but politically, I think any objective observer would find that the ANC were leagues ahead of all the other parties that were in the negotiations. Again, that's because we had accumulated this experience of working in the movement, of working as a collective, of trying to come to collective discussions. We had understood that, even if all of our people didn't understand, but we had understood the need that there are times when you will have to make a compromise because you can't enter negotiations and think that only your positions must carry the day. Well, then don't enter negotiations. And sometimes the National Party thought this was the case. And in the course of the discussions, you turn them around in terms of them coming to agree, by and large, with the kind of positions that you thought were both sustainable, but was also a building block for bringing about a non-racial, non-sexist, and democratic South Africa. So negotiations forces you to think very deeply, to be ready to compromise. And now myself, of course, I was a bit of a hardliner sometimes, and so sometimes they would complain to Valley and say, oh, when Essop Pahad is not in the meeting, then it's so much easier talking to you. And I would come back and I say, hey, I heard what you said. So you're not going to divide the ANC on this funny basis of yours, of goodies and baddies.
But so you were a hawk?
Well, not so much a hawk, but for me, one of the things I thought was that, and it differed, other people thought differently, but for me, one of the things I thought was that in the course of the negotiations, you also had to take hard positions. So you demonstrate to the other side that there's no walkover here. That whilst they had their own firm positions, we were also going to have firm positions. But you knew that always you could say, well, we'll send it upstairs to Cyril and Rolf. But at the same time, what you did was you engaged. Now, I remember that one set of negotiations decided it must take place in Hermanus, in the home of the former Deputy Minister of Justice, National Party. She became an ambassador later. And so I asked one of the National Party people to give me a lift back to Cape Town from Hermanus. Now he's the guy, I forget his name, but he's the guy that left the National Party and then went back into the National Party. And so, as he was giving me a lift, I said to me, listen here, I don't have a car, no, I want a lift back. So he said, okay. So I said to him as he was driving, I said...
So your former political foe enemy and
yeah.
driving in the same car?
Yeah, well, he's giving me a lift.
Okay.
So I said to him, but explain to me, you, what's your problem? What is your problem? So he said, well, our problem for the Afrikaners is the language and religion. I said, okay, what language is your problem? So he said, Afrikaans. I said, what is the problem? I said, but Afrikaans is our language and we must defend it. He says, but Afrikaans is not your language. First of all, you stole some of it from the Malay slaves. But secondly, the mistake you are making in the negotiations is that you're projecting Afrikaans as if it is an exclusive language. The reality is that the majority of Afrikaans-speaking people are black. So you are wrong. What you should do, you should approach Afrikaans as a national language, as a South African language. In that case, there is no problem. We will all agree that we will then also help to promote and defend Afrikaans as a South African language in the same way that we would want to do with other languages.
Right.
Then I said, okay, what religion? He said, yeah, but you see, we're Afrikaners, we are Christians. I said, and what does that mean? How? The majority of Christians are black here in this country. Why is it a white man's religion? So I said to him, you know what? In England, the races, one of their main saints was St. George. Now that guy was as brown as anything. I don't know what was white about St. George. In any case, where did this religion start? It started in the desert. You think they were white? They were brown, no? So what you going on about religion? So he said, but you are a communist. I said, listen, that's a different matter, whether I believe in God or not. The question is, how would we, as the ANC here, respond to people's belief? And I said, the answer is very simple. The majority of South Africans are religious. Whether I believe in God or not is neither here nor there. The majority of South Africans are religious. In any case, our religious groups have played a very important role in the struggle. The churches, and that gave me a lecture about revolutionary theology, and that Frank Chikane and him had developed.
Liberation theology.
Yeah. So I think by the time we got to Cape Town, his mind was blown a bit. Because, you see, they never thought of it in this way.
Right.
Because for them, politics was an exclusive thing. And politics was an exclusive white domain. And so for them it was difficult to understand that the way to resolve for them the fundamental issues of language and religion was to take it out of that narrow chauvinist basis and give it what it really has, which is a universalist basis, in which case the issue doesn't arise anymore in terms of whether or not Afrikaans needs to be protected and promoted and so on and so forth. So that's part of the thing that I think in many ways we also help people from the National Party, but also from the predecessors of the present DA, to just have a better understanding of South Africa, just to have a deeper understanding of what the underlying factors are in the course of the struggle. And they began to get a better understanding of what racism and apartheid was doing to South Africa. Thirdly, you will remember that the National Party insisted that they must bring all the Bantustan ones. What happened was, in the course of the negotiations, all of them came over to the side of the ANC and took our positions. And we then brought them into our discussion groups too. So by the time you were finishing, the National Party was left there standing alone. I mean, the ones that they thought were going to think like them, and the only ones who carried on with them were the ones from Bophuthatswana. But even they, because you had discussions with them outside of the formal sessions to say, but why are you saying this, why are you saying that? What about this, what about that? And they would come back into the session and you find that they begin to talk more consistent with the kind of position that we were taking. So in a sense, I think the negotiations was a fantastic learning experience for all of us, because all of us had to learn. But we also had to learn to listen. And obviously I will admit that some of my comrades were better listeners than I was, from the point of view of what the other side was saying. But you had to learn to listen. And you had to then learn to engage with them during the breaks. I mean, I remember on one occasion, some of the media people came to me and said, but you know, Kobe Kotse doesn't want to give us an interview. Because they'd been asking me some questions, and I said, but why don't you ask Kobe Kotse? He's representing the National Party, he's the Minister of Justice. And they said, no, but Kobe Kotse doesn't want to speak to us. I said, wait. So I went to him and said, Kobe Vakhanan, no? So he said, what's going on? Badunye. Now, Kobe, man, when you so dumb, cop. Those media people, they are going to tell lies about you.
Yeah.
Because they just interviewed me. So I think the best thing is if you go and tell them what you really think yourself, not what I think you said. So that there isn't a distorted version of what he said. Do you really think so? I said, Kobe Khan, man. And he went. So the media are very surprised that the person who got Kobe Kutse to do the interview with them, with me. But he came back to me afterwards and he said, oh, okay, thanks. No, because he was getting a bit uneasy that they were trying to set him up, which was true also. Well, that's the job of the media. They tried to set all of us up and sometimes succeeded. So by the time you finish the interview, what you saw in the newspaper had nothing to do, I think, with what you actually said to them, but it's what they think you should have said. So in that way, we struck up this kind of friendship, if you like, and relationship that we could talk to each other without the barriers that existed at the beginning of the negotiations. So in my case, in Slovo's case, of course, it was a bit more difficult for them to, to come to terms because we're both leaders of the Communist Party. Now for them, I mean, my good grief, the biggest devils in the world are these communists. And now they find these very nice people here who are communists, but they're engaged. And of course, JS was engaging in all kinds of debates with them at another level. And I think that helped to, if you like, not completely, but to some extent, break down the anti-communist prejudice. And it was very deeply ingrained in the National Party, because for them, all communists had horns. Well, even horns that were worse than the devil's horns. So they learned in the course of this thing that the communists were not the worst thing. They also learned that it was futile to try to divide the SACP and the ANC, that this was not going to work, because in a sense all of us took positions that we had collectively arrived at with respect to what the ANC wanted, although different people in different negotiating groups would argue it differently. But at least we were quite sure about the direction we wanted to go. And so all of us were able, coming from different angles, but essentially to take the same direction. And so they when they were difficult, I mean, the National Party fellow was the leader of the National Party in KwaZulu-Natal, and Joel Nachitenja and I, we had to do that part of the negotiations with him around the SABC and the media. And the chap was so hard at heart. So I said, hey, listen here, I'm leaving now. You go and do what you want. He said, what? I said, no, I can't talk to you, man. You're just a mad fellow, you. You're so hard at heart. And you African speaking, what do you know about the English language? You can hardly write English. And now you want to tell me about grammar and full stops. So you want to teach Joel and myself English. Are you mad or something? So you speak Afrikaans. We'll translate into English. You can translate into English. I said, Joel, let's go. They can solve the problem, Cyril and Rolf. Then he said, no, man, Essop, come, man. What's wrong with you? Why are you shouting? You're supposed to... Oh, Danny Skitter was his name. So I said, okay, let's sit down. And then he was very helpful, for example, because he was dealing with Home Affairs and that. When our people had difficulties with Home Affairs, actually they were much better than we are now. You phoned Danny Skitter's PA and said, look, so-and-so has a problem with a document or something. Within a day, they would resolve the issue, honestly. So where our people had some difficulties sometimes with the National Party government in terms of getting certain things, you just picked up the phone to some of them and they would get it done. Sometimes I think, well, they were at least a bit better than we are sometimes, because sometimes it's very difficult to get our people to get things done because they're too busy. But yeah, but you establish that relationship, so it became possible for me, for example, after my altercation with Danny Skitter, to pick up the phone and say, now Danny, what about this problem? Look, such and such a person has got a problem with documentation, they're not able to get this, they're not able to get that, the children need to be put in schools, and so Who just send me the information, would send him the information, would say, talk to my PA, talk to the PA, and they would get it done. Actually, and that's very true, it's not said enough, how the National Party negotiators themselves had become helpful in terms of resolving small issues that people feel, because they were the government, and so they held the reins of power. So in order to get documents, this, that, and the other, you had to do it through them. So in a sense, again, as I said, was a learning experience that all of us benefited from. But I think it also demonstrated that it was possible, in fact, very possible, for South Africans to get together and try to find common solutions to common problems. Now you will recall that, of course, the most difficult ones sometimes in negotiations were people from the IFP.
Right.
Now I remember we started the peace committees here. So the ANC was represented by Thabo Mbeki and Aziz Pahad. COSATU was represented by Sidney Mufamadi, and the party was represented by me. And we brought in the businessmen to head it. We brought in Bishop Mahoba, because we said, we can't just have a white man heading this thing. So we brought Bishop Mahoba, and we used to say to Bishop Mahoba sometimes, him is dead now, hey man, you must be a bit tough, you know.
Yeah.
Don't let this guy just do the rallying as the chair. Now, I'm just publishing an article in The Thinker on the culture of peace, and this American professor is saying such wonderful things about the peace accord, and I said, oh my good grief, was it that important? But it was, but this was before the CODESA negotiations had started. And the IFP was led by this guy, what was his name? He left them then, he died now. And so you would come to agreement, and then the next meeting comes and he takes another position. So he didn't know what he was doing. He was agreeing here, but what he was reporting to Chief Buthelezi, and then they would have that discussion, he would come with something else. So again you learn that, look, these are difficult times, that you think you have an agreement, which we learned then, and you find afterwards that you don't have an agreement. Well, John Hall was chairing it. And then you found that, listen, the best way to do was to carry on working. And separately, if you like, Mbeki and him talking to Mandela, and that they could then talk to Buthelezi outside of the structures to say, but this is what we want to arrive at, this is the kind of agreement we want to make, this is the importance of the peace accord. And of course the National Party was represented by Ruth Meyer. So in a sense, if you like, that kind of getting together in negotiations for some of us began with the peace accord. For others, for Mbeki, for Aziz Pahad, for Joe Klantla, if you remember, Joe was our first Minister of Intelligence, for JZ, the President Zuma. If you recall, they were already involved in secret negotiations with representatives of the National Party government. So they were already beginning to establish certain kinds of relationships with these people where they would be able to talk quite openly and honestly about what needed to be done. And before that, Tupac Botha would be phoning Thabo Mbeki and that, and sending messages to Comrade OR about what the National Party thought needed to be done. The whole question of the phased release of political prisoners. You will recall that Governor Mbeki was the first to be released on that basis, and what should be done. Now they wanted Governor Mbeki to go and sit there in the Eastern Cape and twiddle his thumbs. Now of course it was crazy. Yes. And who's going to ask Umgov to sit still? I mean, it's ridiculous. So of course, Umgov goes to the Eastern Cape, and what the first thing he does, he says, right, where's the ANC underground structures? And where there were none, he begins to form them. Where are the party structures? And where there were none, he begins to bring people round and begins to form these structures of the movement. So this was before we come back in 1919. Now, so negotiations, I think, was a very important part of our own experience and the experience of the other side in the negotiations. And obviously the negotiations were between two fundamental parties, the ANC and the National Party. The IFP with Benny Ngubane, Dr. Benny Ngubane, it was easier to talk to Benny Ngubane than Veldsman, who was in the peace committee. Ben was always more willing to listen, wouldn't push that hard for certain positions, and that. The PAC was with Bani Desai and Patricia, the present mayor. Now Patricia was another hardliner.
And the current deputy president of the Constitutional Court as the PAC negotiator, Degang Moseneke.
Yeah, and Degang was, but you see, that's why he became Deputy Chief Justice. I always used to tell him, how did you land up in the PC? But never mind. Because he should never have been, they should have been in the ANC, but he got arrested as a young 14-year-old for PAC activities, and he stayed in the PAC. But I thought Degang's critical role was later, and we should talk about that. The multi-party committees that we set up in the period leading up to the elections, led by Judge Kriegler. And Degang was the deputy to Kriegler. At the same time, we had to deal with Constant Viljoen and his team. Well, the Mulder brothers now constitute the Freedom Fund. Because they remain very skeptical about whether or not the negotiations would lead to an agreement which would be detrimental. Well, they were skeptical that it would lead to something in favor of them, because they thought it would be not in favor of white Afrikaans-speaking people. Although Constant Viljoen had already established a pretty good rapport with Madiba, but the bulk of the negotiations were done in the beginning with them by Thabo Mbeki and President Zuma. Now Mbeki has an exceptionally remarkable, for me admirable, way of talking and negotiating. One of his great strengths is his capacity to put himself in the other person's shoes. So that when the other side, if you like, the interlocutors, make points, however bad the point might seem to you, because he put himself in their shoes, he immediately had a very deep understanding of what they were saying and why they were saying it. And so in his response to them, he was able to respond to them in a way which made them feel that, no, somebody's listening. That's just once Constant Viljoen accused me and Thabo and them. He said, you took us for a ride. I said, no, more general, we didn't take you for a ride.
On what basis was he saying that?
Because he said that the negotiations and the kind of compromises he thinks they made led to Tony Leon and them inflicting that when they made up with the National Party, inflicted that terrible defeat on them in the elections. And I guess maybe he still thinks that, I don't know. But so you will recall that there was also the discussion around the Volksstaat.
Yeah.
And by this time, obviously, the elections had taken place. The ANC was the ruling party, and so the differences then were held from totally different positions, because here we were the ones who were exercising political power. The others had lost political power. But it took a long time. You will recall that we set up commissions, they produced all kinds of reports. In the end, we met even in the Raadstaal in Pretoria. Now I remember, because there was a group of Afrikaners that came, and they were kind of ignoring Boshoff, Verwoerd's son-in-law.
Yeah.
No, but Professor Boshoff was the main person behind setting up Oranje. But we found him to be very reasonable, understanding, he's ready to listen. He wanted his little enclave. And I went to him back here and said, Chief, you know, these guys, that's these other Afrikaners, now they are surrounding you. You are the deputy president. And they are ignoring Boshoff. So me, I'm going to bring him. And I'm going to put him in the center there. And he understood what I was saying. He said, okay, do it. So I brought Boshoff, and he hugged Boshoff, and he spent a lot of time talking to Boshoff, which really blew Boshoff's mind too. Because he understood that the others were kind of distancing themselves from him, because they thought he was a bit too radical for them, because he wanted his Oranje. They wanted also some kind of Afrikaner homeland, but on different bases. In the end, by the way, that part in the constitutional thing was essentially drafted by me in the committee. The Kader Asmal had come, had been asked to help. We finished that at about, I guess, about 2:30, 3 in the morning. And then we agreed to the wording that appears in the Constitution. And essentially, it was us saying that, just perfectly acceptable, that people will have a right to continue to ask for a Volksstaat. In any case, you can't ban it. And Corne Mulder was sitting there, and this other Afrikaner guy that I was talking to you about practically burst into tears. We didn't realize that Essop Pahad is so good. We agree with this wording. So when we went back to adopt the thing, Cyril, who was co-chairing with with this other one, was the Deputy Minister of Justice, because that was the Constitutional Committee. So Cyril said, sent me a note and said no, but Essop Pahad from the ANC will inform us about the discussion they've just held. This is about 3, 4 in the morning now. And what is the final decision? So I said, no, sorry, Comrade Chair. I've asked Corne Mulder to do it. Now, I'd gone to Corne and Constant and said, look, I think this is a breakthrough. And I think that what we've all agreed to has advantages for you, has advantages for us. But I don't think I should introduce it. I think Corne should introduce it. And it would be much better for us in South Africa, everybody else, if Corne introduces. So then you also had a heart attack. What? I said, no, So I said, no, Commissioner, Corne Mulder from the FF will introduce. So which he did.
Yes.
Now, in a sense, that was just one indication of how we were able to break in the end, the Freedom Front didn't sign the Constitution, as you know, because they still had some problems and difficulties with some areas of the Constitution. But the point I'm making is that even on what seemed to be the trickiest and complex areas of negotiations, we were able to find each other. And partly they had to do with, I think it was essentially an ANC approach, which was to try to say, bottom line, fine, but after that, look, it doesn't hurt us to give in sometimes to something that is of such importance, or they think is so important to them, and actually it's not in the overall scheme of things. I mean, for example, the National Party people came to me. We wanted something from them around party political funding. And so they thought that they were going to put the ANC into difficulties, and they said to me, okay, we'll give you that if you will agree that you need 70% or 75% to change the fundamental clauses of the Constitution. And you must agree that in the Constitution we will constitutionalize a multi-party system. So I said, yes, that's no problem, we'll do it. So in the meantime, I haven't talked to the ANC. So I then went to the ANC negotiating team and said, look, there's what they're proposing, and I've agreed. They said, you have agreed? I said, yes. Who wants to change the fundamental human rights of the Constitution? It'd be crazy. So what difference does it make? We say 2/3 for the rest of the thing, we say 75%. What difference does it make to us? Because we as ANC have no intention whatsoever. And if there's a military coup d'etat, they don't care about the Constitution. So what does it difference if you put 75% or 2/3? But they think that they don't trust us still. So agreed. As a multi-party system, that's our position. We don't want a one-party state, but we want this from them on party political funding. Agreed. So I go back, I say, fine, we agree to this, but you must agree to this. Then, okay, we'll agree to that. And because they were a bit wary about putting in the party political funding coming from the state.
Yeah.
I know they knew they were going to lose the elections. We knew we were going to win the elections. And we had in any case, by that time we'd already won the elections, so it was after the elections. And so they had to then agree to that. But as I say again, you're able to come to this kind of give and take. But neither side was giving anything or taking anything.
So how did that whole process influence the government of national unity and subsequent governments?
Well, you will recall that the early part of the National Party negotiations was they wanted all kinds of guarantees to be written in which would essentially protect white power. And we said, you're crazy, man. We'll never agree to this. So you want to preserve your white privileges, you're going to have to find some other ways. They're not going to find it in the Constitution. That's not possible, which they had to give up in the end. But they then also argued, which was consistent with the positions we were taking in the ANC, that look, it's very important that post the first elections, that we create the climate as well as the atmosphere for some relative peace and stability. And therefore, this call for a government of national unity is not against our interests. But Mandela will be the president, and we'll have two deputy presidents. Whoever Mandela appoints deputy president from the ANC will be the one, and National Party will be the clerk. Of course, Mandela then said we'll take it further. We'll bring in other parties, invited Buthelezi, and if you will recall that at that time the IP had 3 ministers. He invited Tony Leon also to join. Tony Leon turned it down. And so...
Why did he turn it down?
Tony Leon is a foolish politician. No, because he thought that from the outside, if he shouts loudest, then he'll be heard the most. So, and in the end, the only way they succeeded was to swallow the National Party, not because of his shouting. So he turned it down because he thought, no, if he's standing on the... I haven't read his book, so I don't know what he says. But if you're from the outside, then you're not going to be sucked in to be seen to be lackeys of the ANC.
But that time was a complex period of transition, and it was important for political parties to display their responsibility towards building a...
But that's why I'm saying that, look,
and constitutional state.
Tony writes beautifully. He's very well read. He is a good lawyer. But I say stupid because he didn't understand this fundamental thing. He didn't understand the need to create as great a unity as possible in order to govern South Africa. He was more interested in pushing his own positions, and that is, for him, what happens to his party was more important than what happens to the country. So, from that point of view, he refused to come in, but was forever asking to meet Mandela and to meet Mbeki and all of these things. So he wanted to have his cake and eat it. But I think it was a very silly decision on his part not to come in. I think it would have given a greater sense of national unity. In the end, of course, the government of national unity would have to unravel, that's for sure. But at least in the beginning. The other thing was that which people don't fully understand and appreciate. How do you create real political stability? Now, people forget that lots of people died in the political violence before the 1994 elections, mainly in KZN, but in the townships, in Alexander Township, in Soweto, and that. Two, you had a military establishment, a security establishment, which was very efficient, very well organized, with very highly trained personnel. And a group of Afrikaners, no more than 50, 100. And given the arms they had and access to this military equipment, could create havoc. Now you have to therefore understand and say, but what do you need to do to pull the rug from under the feet of those that were determined to come out against a democratic South Africa? And they were. And therefore you, in the course of negotiations, accepted that yes, the pensions of these people will be protected, but by the way, that also meant protecting the pensions of all these foolish Bantustan people who I don't think did a day's work, but they were chief directors. And in Transkei, they appointed themselves, as soon as negotiation, chief directors and deputy director generals and director generals, so their salaries shot up, and we had to pay them the pension according to the position they were occupying. Some of them were ambassadors, I don't know what they were representing, but you had to take them in. But the idea was really, you also had to send a very strong message and signal to these people that there's a place for them in South Africa, that there's no apocalypse coming.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you recall, there were no changes made in the top hierarchy of the security forces, the military, the police, and that. Although those discussions had been going on parallel to CODESA negotiations, there were those bilateral discussions taking place between those in government security forces and those coming from the ANC side. And people don't understand that it was, I think, on the side of the ANC-led alliance, quite a remarkable thing to come to an understanding that the way you were going to get peace and stability is to compromise on those things. That you had to convince people that your objective of a non-racial, non-sexist democratic society included them too. That you were not going to deprive them of their pensions. You were not going to deprive them of their property. Because it was very important that they had this understanding that you were not going to willy-nilly deprive them of the land. If you look at the land, the way the property clause is drafted in the Constitution, it's still creating, some people think, some serious problems. But that was the last compromise that we made in terms of the Constitution negotiations. But you had to give them this comfort. Now some people think that we overdid it.
Yeah.
Well, they must answer as to what they think could have possibly happened had you not given this comfort to these groups of people. Had we not brought in Constant Viljoen, and had Madimba not also established that close relationship with Constant, because if you remember, they were asking Constant Viljoen and them to lead this army of theirs. You will then recall that they sent their troops into Bophuthatswana, and the turning point came when this black soldier who belonged to their army shot these white officers in cold blood. And they then realized that the things had fundamentally changed. So you had to understand that the way forward was to take this position, that once you, and you will remember that we had already won the elections when the final constitution was adopted, that you still had to give comfort to a very important group of people who could cause great uncertainty and could cause grave problems for a democratic South Africa. And I think that in a real sense we succeeded in that. So that political violence disappeared from the radar. The threat of a right-wing military coup completely receded. You remember that even during the elections they were throwing off some bombs here and there, just receded. They tried to reorganize themselves, but our security forces, by the way, with the great assistance of the former heads of these security forces who were in the democratic government security forces, without them we would not have been able to capture some of these ultra right-wing Afrikaners. So even people like, what's his name, the one who fell off his horse, Ter Blanche.
Eugene Ter Blanche.
So in the end they were isolated. Now in 1990, you could not go to Ventersdorp, because I went. It was hell, I can promise you. Even our own ANC people were saying, we're not going there, we can't go there. And I remember with Ruth Mompati, she went to Ventersdorp, they just went to the hotel, preventing her from leaving. Now, in that situation, you had to find a way out. And that's why I think people who understand what was happening have such great respect for the negotiating process here and say everybody else must learn because you learn to say how do you bring people, and therefore the issue of the government of national unity was part of this. And having the IFP in government, and look, Buthelezi used to come to cabinet, and if he doesn't like something, he would just come with a written statement and distribute it to all the other cabinet ministers and deputy ministers. So he stood his ground when he thought he needed to stand his ground, but it couldn't be the final decision. The final decision obviously was going to lay with the ANC ministers, but again there you had to take into account what is possible and what is not possible. So can other people benefit from my experience? Yes. I think they can benefit a great deal from our experience. And one of the things people ask me, I say, listen, there must be a willingness on the main protagonists to make some compromises. There must be a willingness for those who think they will be the victors to be ready to say, even if you're going to win an election, there are certain other things that you have to give. That coming into power doesn't mean concentrating all your power in one basket. Anyway, you learn very quickly that power is much more diffuse than that. So I think that in that sense, if you like, we did very well. Now, I just want to say something about the elections. You must remember that for the elections, and the National Party, to their credit, agreed to us setting up an independent electoral commission, because prior to that, for the white elections, like in England, Home Affairs would conduct the elections. We said never. You know what? We said never. Want an independent electoral commission, and that's what we got, and that's where Dihang was a deputy to Judge Kriegler. I've told us to Judge Kriegler, if there is a person that saved this country at that time, it was Kriegler.
During the elections?
And before the election too. Because the way he headed that independent electoral commission, through him and Dihang, we formed the multi-party committee, where all the political parties who were going to participate in elections, we came together. We had weekly meetings where we discussed common issues. It's still running. It's still one of the best things that they must keep on doing, because you were able to bring together the parties and resolve issues at a multilateral level. And people would raise questions. I mean, after we had won the 94 election, when it came to the 99 election, I used to chow my head, because I was representing the ANC, and complain after complaint. No, man, please, what you complain about? Complain about something sensible. But Kriegler ran that elections in a way which I think was remarkable, with the assistance of Dihang in that. If it was not for Kriegler, we would not have had those elections. And I think the country would have possibly get into such a conflagration that we would have found it difficult even now to be able to say that we're living in a peaceful country. Because Johan understood some things. And one of the fundamental things he understood was, you are going to have a free and fair, relatively free and fair and democratic elections. And he was going to do everything necessary to ensure that it succeeds. And he ran that multi-party committee with Dihang chaired, but he ran that election thing in a way in which he always did this. And there were many times that where there were disputes between us, I mean, on my side with representing the ANC, and Azar Kachalia was the other one with me, and we had disputes with the predecessors of the Democratic Alliance in it. By and large, you would agree with us. And I remember my wife was an ANC person helping to count the votes or to make sure that vote counting was done properly. So she was at Nazareth, which was one of the main vote counting stations. And this former deputy minister that I was talking about, whose house we had gone to in Hermanus, was there for the National Party. Now some of the ballot boxes, I think as they were throwing them, had broken open. And she was refusing that they begin the vote count. Partly the IFP ones were supporting because they knew they had lost the bloody elections. And so because I phoned my wife about 3 what are you doing? She said, hey, we haven't even started counting. These people are giving us a lot of trouble here. That she was just a part of the ANC team, but so the ANC team was led by I don't know who, but Johan went there. What's happening? Blah, blah, blah. All the sides go and tell him what they think. And he said, right, count. So this one from the next man, no, you can't count. Yes, you are going to count. He gave them an order to count. And they had to start counting the votes. Now you must remember, if they hadn't started counting the votes, and the next day, that our people, if they knew that voting hadn't started, you don't know what could have happened. Because they could have stormed the place. Because that was stealing the elections. Right. And Johan intervened at the right time, took the right decisions. And in the course of the elections, of course, there were disputes. The ANC had very serious disputes with a number of polling booths in KwaZulu-Natal. It was true. We didn't even send our observers there because you might not come back alive. In one or two of those 2 polling booths, we didn't even have IC observers. They were complaining that in the Transkei and some other townships and that the ANC people were just ruling the roost. So they were not able to do proper checking and all of these things. And the ANC complained bitterly about what was happening in KwaZulu-Natal. And I said, but in the end, the thing is, what is the main objective? The main objective is we must win these elections, and we are going to win them. So even after the elections, a delegation came from KwaZulu-Natal, the ANC won. They were of the view that we should ask the IEC to declare the rest of the country elections free and fair, but not KZN, because of the things that had happened, which are true, that there were lots of places that the IP was in control of where there was no way you were going to get free and fair elections. So I said in the meeting, if you go there, Krichle is going to kick you out of his office. So they said, what? I'm telling you. My view is that the judge has decided that the way South Africa has to be saved is by having these free and fair elections, and he's going to declare them free and fair. Notwithstanding all these anomalies on all sides. They went. He chased them out of his office. And they came back and I said, but I did tell you people. Look, the important thing is that the IFP has won there. We'll have to get it back. But if we don't declare these elections free and fair, and the IEC cannot declare one part not free and fair, because that means the conflagration arises in KZN, you can't control it.
Yeah. So tell me now, when you fast-tracked to becoming minister, deputy minister in the office of Deputy President Thabo Mbeki at the time, and then minister minister of the presidency, when Thabo Mbeki was president of the country, there was a view that part of the inner circle leadership role that you played was at times quite tough, uh, relatively to non-performance or performance, or pushing a particular trajectory of policy, but also ensuring political harmonization with the Mbeki government at the time. Is that a fair reflection?
A lot of it is myth.
Please tell us about it.
Well, maybe my graph manner makes people think that that's okay. But let me start somewhere else, because when Madiba appointed Mbeki as the deputy president, I get a phone call from Mbeki to say, what are you doing? We're living in observatory at that time. I said, well, actually, as it happens, I have a bit of a cold. He said, no, I'm sending my car. Let's go to Pretoria. Pretoria? Yes. Well, I haven't seen the union buildings. Now, he didn't have an office. Mandela had an office, and he took some of the ANC people with him, Barbara Masekela, and at the old Foreign Affairs had given him some people, this Ambassador Streeter and others, who were quite good. De Klerk had taken the bottom part of the union buildings and ensconced himself there, had already more than 60 with his organogram, everything. So I would go. So I said, but you know, Chief, this building, I have two memories. One is my mother in the famous Women's March, because she was a participant in that march. And I recall her speaking as a little kid. I don't know, she saw some white guy waving. And for her, that was a very important part of the march. That one white guy working there was kind of waving at them. And the second one was, there was a group of Indian women. They decided to go to Pretoria to demonstrate against this Asiatic things that they were setting up. And so me, this young, strong guy said, I'm going. My mother was also going. So I said, okay, I'll go in the bus. No, I'll help. So this very strong man goes, and we're standing there, and the police came with their dogs, and the dog put the teeth on my thigh, and this young strong man disappeared very fast. And the women just stood their ground. So there was a good salutary lesson. Right. There said, Chief, this was. So we go into the union buildings, and there are these white guys there. And they say to him, well, welcome, Deputy President. We'll take you around and you can choose an office. So I said, what? No such thing. What do you mean Deputy President walks around and chooses an office? What nonsense is this? I'll do it. So he says, Chief. I thought it was an insult to ask the Deputy President to walk around and choose. So I go. And the first NAS officer I see, I said, no, we'll take this office for him. Now, we go in there. There's no paper. Oh, do you want to just pull the phone off the hook? Otherwise, it's going to keep ringing. So I said, okay, we'll take this office. A very nice office. Actually, as it happens, it was Dave Stewart's office, was the DG. Yeah, wonderful wood paneling and all these things. So I said, yeah, we'll take this office. There's his office there and the adjoining office. He's got nobody with him. There were two, one white guy, one white woman that Foreign Affairs had put there. Thank goodness for them. Because you go there, he walks in this office, it's totally empty. There's not even a paper clip on the table. In the meantime, Mandela is sending him documents that he must sign. Because the president has to sign and both deputy presidents had to sign. So, but he brought the pen, because it had to be a special pen that you had, nothing else. So I say to these white ones, hey, what happens here, man? I mean, there's no paper, there's no pen, nothing here. Don't worry. They pick up the phone. Talking in Afrikaans. There comes the paper, and there comes the pen, and there comes pen. So at least it began to look like a bit of an office. He hadn't had a PA. Then Nomsa came later. Nomsa Lutuli, Chief Lutuli's granddaughter. Well, Nomsa Ngakane. So the first lot of things is I'm sitting there, but I'm an elected MP. I mean, I just went to help him because he said I must go. So I all of a sudden decided, oh, I must now be like a PA. People want to make appointments, they come to me. I say, well, Chief, the so-and-so wants to be here, so-and-so. And there was no security. I mean, people were just walking into the union buildings and coming to, hey, who are you? No, we want to see the deputy president. But who are you? Okay, wait. Go to me, say, somebody's outside. And you would see them. So his office started with nothing. Then he brought in Nomsa, then he brought in Mafolo, because Mafolo he knew because Mafolo was with him in the ANC International Department that they were running, and then they began to build the office. I was an elected MP, but I was helping them. Then he appointed me parliamentary councillor, but that took some time. Now to answer your question, no, I think that for me, yes, of course, as his parliamentary councillor, I had to see him often, because one of my responsibilities as parliamentary councillor was to try to brief him about what was going on in parliament, because as the deputy president, he was the main ANC representative, leading the ANC in parliament, at least in the National Assembly, but when joint sittings in parliament took place. And to try to give him an understanding what the thinking going on in the ANC and so on and so forth, and still we're working with people from the National Party and Freedom Front and all of these things. So in a sense, one had to do that. So as parliamentary councillor, I was not a member of the cabinet committees or a cabinet. So it had no impact upon government policy at all. As a deputy minister, you were a member of cabinet committees, but you were not a member of cabinet.
Right.
But for me, the reason why I don't think that was true was that yes, he would consult. But he would consult with his ministers and deputy ministers at the point at which he thought the issues that he was dealing with, or cabinet was going to deal with, or the ANC was going to deal with, had to do with the portfolios that people were leading, and they were therefore best placed to offer advice. So it's nonsensical to suggest that somehow or the other, I don't know, there were 3 or 4 people sitting and making decisions about how to run government. There was no way you were going to make decisions sitting in any room about matters concerning finance without the Minister of Finance, because whatever you decided would still have to go to the Minister of Finance, would still have to go to Treasury. And the way cabinet functions is that cabinet memorandums are driven by the particular ministry and department, not by somebody else sitting in some kitchen cabinet. So whatever you think you might have decided, those things would have to come from there. So for me, there was no such thing. But of course you were meeting, of course you were discussing, of course you tried to exchange views and so forth about what you thought was happening in general. Secondly, we were always guided, always, by the policies that were adopted by the ANC at National Conference. Always. Of course, there were criticisms that sometimes they were making claims that they were not implementing ANC policies. But what do you mean? ANC policies adopted at National Conference, by its very nature, cannot be details. Because people participating in them don't have the necessary information. what government has to do, which happens in other parts of the world too, is that you then say, this is the policy of the ruling party. This is our policy. Anyway, we're sitting on the National Executive Committee of the ANC. How then do we give effect to these policies? And then, of course, when you come to the details, you put in things that you yourself might not have thought of earlier.
Is that the modalities of implementation?
And but that's first of all the modalities of making policy. Because the modalities of implementing are totally different. And we were very good at making policies. We had certain advantages that we came late onto the scene. Perhaps we were not as good in implementing the policies, and I'm still trying to understand why sometimes we were not able always to implement these wonderful policies that were developed. So policy was driven by ANC Lekgotla, by the ANC National Conference, by our ANC Lekgotlas. Remember, we set up the Lekgotla system, by discussions in the National Working Committee, by discussions in the National Executive Committee of the ANC. So always you operated within the framework of how you understood ANC policies. There were then the alliance meeting, which also impacted upon the kind of policies that you eventually adopted. So it's the policy making is much more broader and much more complex and involves many more other role players than just some group of people. Whoever they tried it, they would have failed. Because remember that with the policy things, you then had to take into account the views of COSATU, take into account the views of other trade unions. You had to take into account the views of business. You had to take into account the views of some other areas of civil society who had their own views on a whole number of things. So therefore, policies were never made and could never be made by a small group of people. Of course, a small group of people can sit and think that they're running the country, but they would be deluding themselves. So for Mbeki...
Were you the whip as claimed, political?
No, man, I don't know what a whip means. Mbeki didn't need any whips. He had a sharp enough tongue to do so. Look, for my own, and therefore I've been trying to get people to understand. Right. You will recall that those in the ANC who wanted to remove him in Polokwane, and some of them in the leadership of the SACP put it out that he was an autocrat, that he was stifling debates and so on and so forth. And I've asked someone, and said, but where? In the National Executive Committee of the ANC, and Thabo, what he learned from OA, never participated. He would do the political input, which is what the president has to do, and then the people would discuss. And he would hardly participate in the discussions. At the end, he might come in and bring the things together. And there were times, for example, when Terra was chair of the ANC. And Terra used to chair the NEC meetings. And Terra would attempt to sum up some very hard discussions, because remember that there are critically different opinions, sometimes harsh opinions said in meetings of the NEC. And you had to bring this together to synthesize them so that the NEC can come to a common position which we can put to the rest of the movement. And as soon as Terra finished summing up, all the hands went up. All. Nobody agreed with him. Mbeki would then say, wait, no. Let's not reopen the debates. I think what Comrade Chair is saying to the NEC, and then he would sum up, and everybody would say, yes, we agree. The same in Cabinet. On very few occasions did he take the lead in the discussions, because the Cabinet discussions, in any case, you had the discussions in the Cabinet committees, Cabinet committees make recommendations to the cabinet. The cabinet documents are there, the recommendations of the cabinet committee are there, and basically you agree with the cabinet committee because they had time to really hopefully look at with some detail at these questions. And so Mbeki always allowed everybody to speak.
Was that the nature of...
That's the way he works.
The collective
And
leadership of cabinet?
yes, and so therefore I asked, but where was he autocratic? Where did he, can anybody give me one instance in which he demanded that we agree with his point of view? Then they would say, well, Zimbabwe. I said, but what about Zimbabwe? We sent people to Zimbabwe. One time the committee was led by the former Minister of Labour, after him, Jeff Hadebe. I said, then we have our own Minister of Foreign Affairs and Deputy Minister of Foreign who have a responsibility to carry out the foreign policy of the government. And when we discussed Zimbabwe, and when Mbeki intervened, his arguments were so persuasive that if you were going to disagree with him, you had better know what you were disagreeing about. So then the question came that, of course, he argued persuasively. That's what he did with big business. When we used to have these bilateral meetings with big business, they shouted about Zimbabwe. Sometimes he spoke for 40 minutes. When he finished, they said, no, please, now we understand, President. So it's the same with HIV and AIDS. It's still a big debate. But not to get into this debate, but Mbeki never ever said that HIV does not cause AIDS, never. And nobody will ever be able to produce a single statement made by him which said that. The issue was around ARVs and whether or not the side effects were so bad that in the end your own budget, medical budget, would get out of kilter. And the second one was, which was his view all along, we must understand this phenomena. What are we going to do about it? The ARVs are too expensive, they're not affordable. And if they have to go from one regime to another one, it's not going to be affordable. And if you can't keep on giving people ARVs, that's another death sentence. So people must give credit where it's due. It was him, because Zazana was the Minister of Health at that time, who drove the campaign for a reduction in drug prices. Who got the United Nations to agree? Who picks up the phone to Kofi Annan? Thabo. Who then talks to the big CEOs of the pharmaceutical companies to say this is unacceptable? Our people can't afford this. The poor people of the world can't afford your drug price. So, secondly, if you look at the budget, and Trevor was the Minister of Finance, the amount of money that was given to dealing with HIV and AIDS grew exponentially.
But, no, that's great. It gives quite a window into it. A last question, and we've only got like a minute left, is a quick snapshot into, we've heard from the former President Kgalema, his understanding and the difficulties he had to deal with those 8 days in September when President Thabo Mbeki were recalled. Sitting in the presidency, what went on in your head when that happened?
No, let me just take 2 minutes. Once the NEC had made a decision to ask Mbeki to resign, the next day I went to his house. There were other people there too. And I said to him, Comrade President, I've come to inform you that I'm resigning as a minister and I'm resigning as a member of parliament. And he said to me, but I haven't asked you to. I said, but I didn't come and ask your permission either. So he said to me, but why? Because you haven't been asked to resign. The NEC has only asked me to resign. I said, no, but Chief, for us, certainly for our generation, we know and we understand, and we've always said so, it's in our blood, that we are only what we are because of the ANC. The ANC is what made us. The ANC is our life. If I cannot honestly serve the leadership of the ANC, the NEC, because I believe, very firmly believe, that the decision they've arrived at is unjust, the timing is all wrong, how then do I serve? I will not resign from the ANC, no. But how then do I serve, honestly serve, the National Executive Committee of the ANC, which is the leadership of our organization, honestly and truthfully? I can't do it. And so, it's better if I resign. What will you do? I don't know what I will do. It's not going to be the first time in my life that I didn't know what to do. I'll just go home and tell my wife, I've already told her that she's going to have to work harder to earn more money in the meantime before I find something to do, which is what happened. I said to my wife, listen, before, when I was working full-time, you had to work and bring the children up and feed us, which is true. This is what you had to do. I said, now you just have to work harder, and that's fine. Maybe get another job where you earn more money until I see what happens to my pension and what else I will do. So no, I took the decision in a very firm belief as an individual, and the others did the same. There was no collective decision making. They took their own decision, and they had their own reasons. I had mine, and I still believe that it was a very wrong decision. It was a very unjust decision, and the timing was all wrong, and the reasons for coming to that decision were completely wrong, and therefore I could not support a National Executive Committee, which is my leadership. Whether I vote for them or not is irrelevant. Once a conference takes place and a leadership is elected, that is the leadership of the organization, and that is the leadership we support. And so for those reasons, I resign, both as a minister as well as a member of parliament. And to tell you the truth, I didn't know what I was going to do next. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your time.
Okay. Thanks for your time.